Hello and welcome to another Star Wars The Old Republic video. In this video we're going to be looking at a detailed guide to gearing, stats, and all the things you need to know so you don't have to look up a specific individual guide for each character you want to gear. So this will give you the baseline fundamentals and understandings of all these different mechanisms in the game. There are going to be timestamps and chapters as usual, so you can jump around to the information that's the most useful to you. Alright, the basics of getting better gear. Item rating is key. The general idea is you want to keep increasing your item rating as much as possible until you reach your max level, and then keep pushing up until you hit the maximum item rating you can, right? There is a bit of a distinction though in terms of the color or quality of the gear. So gear can be green, blue, purple, gold, and the quality increases in that order. So gold is the best quality gear. So if you have two pieces of gear at the same item rating, you're going to find that if it's a better quality, it should be better gear than the one that's a lower quality. You'll also find that the way they design these expansions is we start off with a chunk of gear for this expansion that players farm for the end gear game. They start with the green quality at a lower item rating, and as they progress up, they get gold at the highest, and then the next expansion comes along and it says, we're going to put the new gear at a higher item rating, but green quality starting here. And then you work your way up to blue gear, purple gear, gold gear, right? So just keep that in mind, but more or less, we're just chasing the highest item rating possible, and then we start looking at the color quality increase once we've maxed out our item rating. The other idea to keep in mind as you're leveling up and as you're working your way through gear is that you can't hit most of the stat thresholds we're going to talk about, and you're replacing gear so fast. They also introduce set bonuses on a lot of stuff, so as you progress throughout these different sets of gear that came along with each expansion, generally you can go to places where you can find bonuses that are applied to gear, and they're applicable at certain levels. If you're level 80, you're going to be looking for the legendary implants instead of having it on your armor, and you're going to be wanting to get tacticals. Tacticals you can get as early as level 75, and those will give you bonuses that increase what you do. Pretty much every other expansion before 7.0, you got all of your bonuses on the actual gear pieces themselves. If you want to get the best gear that's available for your level just to make yourself a baller as you're running through content, crafted gear is the way to go. So you can craft gear for different levels that's going to be a lot stronger than the gear that you would find off of the vendors or that you would go and pick up off of open world bosses. But if you find that's a little too time consuming or you just aren't set up to be able to craft like that, I've got my Vendors of SWTOR video where I go over where you can go to different vendors at different levels to buy gear to increase your item rating if the game's lagging a little bit on giving you that better gear. Now, when we talk about how the game actually gives you gear, there are a few weird, interesting things that the game does. So the game will determine how it gives you gear appropriate to your level. If you're just doing missions, your main story quest, it really doesn't care what your level is. It just says, here's a piece of gear. This is what we decided that piece of gear should be. And it's kind of like F you if you've gone ahead and leveled up a bit faster than they expected. Oh well, just deal with it. The other area is when you're on planets, you're going to notice that there's two different loot tables depending on your level. As long as you don't exceed the maximum level of a planet, there's going to be a loot table that includes a bunch of the original cosmetic items, gear that's appropriate for that planet's level, so on. As soon as you pass the maximum level of that planet, you're going to be level synced down, and it moves you over to a second loot table, which is much smaller, and it's basically saying you can get gear that's appropriate for the level you're at, and we're not going to drop you all the other cool cosmetic items and stuff like that. So if you're wondering why it's so hard to farm Datacron decorations for your strongholds, that's why, because you've outleveled the planet you're on. Yay. Now, the last places that you're going to be able to get gear that's appropriate to your level at all times is doing flashpoints, operations, which you can't do until you're level 80, and conquest. Those will definitely give you gear that's appropriate to your level whenever you play them. Unless you're at your max level cap, might not be worth going that way to find gear because you'll quickly outlevel it as well. Let's talk about stats. How do stats increase your character's power and what matters about them? Well, first off, I want to point out your main hand and your offhand will have two additional stats. These stats are going to be called force power or tech power. They're a bonus that's only found on these items. Also important to note that if you're wanting to use a tanking style class, you can wear a shield as your offhand, and wearing a shield is the only way to be able to shield attacks. But you're going to miss out on some of that force or tech power as a result of equipping it. Mastery is the main big OG, big daddy, whatever. It is your big stat, right? Mastery, though, can be thought of as doing two different things for you. It can be thought of as increasing your power stat and your critical stat. Then we're going to look at power. Power is just straight up makes things hit harder. It's pretty simple. It's going to increase your healing, your damage. Endurance is very simple. More endurance, more health. Accuracy can be a little bit misleading. 100% accuracy doesn't actually mean you're going to hit things. 100% accuracy means you're going to hit something that has a 0% defense chance against you, or armor, we'll call it. So when you're playing against enemies at the same level as you, they can have up to a 10% defense chance. Alacrity is the stat that basically determines how fast you're able to do everything. By default, the game has a global cooldown of 1.5 seconds, and every ability that's on the global cooldown, when you click one of those abilities, they're all put on cooldown for 1.5 seconds and can't be used again. As you increase your alacrity to certain points, it'll decrease the global cooldown by 0.1 of a second. We'll talk about some of the weird, confusing things about alacrity in the last section, as there's a lot of stuff to go over here. Critical stat, this basically increases your critical chance and your critical multiplier, which allows you to do more damage or more heals. Defense stat, this provides a higher chance to defend against certain type of attacks. Defense chance is a roll that basically says if this roll succeeds, you take 0 damage from this type of attack. The defense stat, it's important to note that it does not impact all damage types, so basically white damage is what you're mitigating against, not yellow damage. Shield chance, if you have a shield equipped on your offhand, you can put additional stats into shield, and this will increase the percent chance of shielding an attack. Absorb, if you have a shield equipped and you have a certain percent chance of shielding an attack, you will absorb that percentage of the damage if you successfully shield. Presence, this stat is exceptionally useful for making your companions better, but there's no real direct ways to influence it with your gear, so I'm not going to talk about it in any detail. Now let's just take a look. You might have noticed in the background here on this footage that I've kind of been scrolling around showing you where some different stuff is as we talk about it. I just wanted to reiterate it's very important with the UI here that when you click on your character sheet, click this details button and then you scroll this list. And it's very, very helpful to know you can scroll around and see the stats displayed in different ways. Very important for accuracy. Aim for 110% accuracy. You want to scroll down and see this number down here. That's your total accuracy, including gear, passives, buffs, your base accuracy, etc. Right? And it's very useful to be able to hover over some of these to see the breakdowns, especially when we think about something like defense chance. You can see here why only certain types of damage are mitigated by a defense chance. All right, what stats do we want to actually have for all of these different stats we've covered? Well, let's break it down by the generic roles you're going to be playing. I won't focus on details for every single combat style, but I will point out a couple of small exceptions to the rule. Damage classes, 110% accuracy for all player versus environment content. That is your primary stat you're going for. If you're doing PvP, 105%. You want to get this one before any of your other stats that we're going to talk about. Alacrity, you're going to want to reach 7.5% alacrity. This is slightly over the threshold. I'll talk about it in the last section if you're curious why we need to go a little bit higher than the threshold. But 7.5, if you can't get that high, don't even bother with alacrity. Put the rest of those points into critical or something else in the meantime until you can get 7.5% alacrity. There are some classes that give themselves a bonus to alacrity. If you are playing such as lightning telekinetics and you get a 5% alacrity buff, or if you're using the guild perk Zeal, then you can actually aim for the next alacrity threshold at 15.7%. How the game stands right now, the 3% buff that Arsenal Gunnery or Combat Carnage gets isn't enough to make it worth going to that 15.7%. So we're going to skip it until they give us gear with even more stats on it. Critical stat, basically we're just going to dump the remaining points into critical. Because of the limited number of points we have available to us, once you've hit your accuracy threshold and your alacrity target, then the rest of the points just go into critical and it's only what you have left over. There is a certain point where it's more valuable to take a power relic, so a 30% chance of increasing your power, instead of the 30% chance of increasing your critical chance relic, and generally that's when you're around 4,000 critical stat that you'd switch that relic out. For a healer, heals don't miss, so you don't actually need any accuracy. Yes, your interrupts and your attacks will occasionally miss by not having any accuracy, but you get such a little bonus because you don't really do a lot of damage, you don't really need to worry about using those abilities much, that we just don't focus on any accuracy for a healer. Alacrity then is a big thing that we can play around with a lot. So you can go anywhere between that 7.5% all the way to going a little bit past that 15.7%. Play around with it, see what you like best. Nobody really has proven that there's one alacrity that's the best. It usually comes down to just kind of what you prefer. I would still suggest sticking fairly close to that alacrity threshold. Like I wouldn't go with 13%. And then the rest of our points are going to critical. We're just going to dump whatever we have left into crit. For a tank. Now, tanks do have a lot of different stats compared to healers and DPS, so let's talk about those ones. So defense stat. Generally, you want to get defense stat because it gives you a chance to completely avoid taking white damage, but it has a very strong diminishing returns. So at some point you might want to think about stop putting in extra defense stat and look at putting some power in instead. Shield chance is a must, and this is very important. You should generally be aiming for 45% shield chance, and yeah, you just want to make sure you shield an attack before you absorb. There's no point in having it absorb if you can't shield. If you are in a situation where you have fairly low stats from your gear overall, and your absorb chance is below 30% while your shield is at 45, I'd bring those two a little bit closer together. So make sure that your absorb stat is bumped up to 30%, as long as your shield chance doesn't drop below 36-37% chance. Speaking of absorb, that's the general idea, is just whatever points are left over, and you want to try and get a minimum of 30% absorb stats. Accuracy is not required on a tank, as we get a bonus 10% accuracy, so we don't need any at all. And there's also hybrid skank tank builds which allow you to add damage stats into your tank, but it's such a variable thing and it's a lot more complex than I'm going to cover in this guide. Alright, so I'm going to take a break here. This kind of gives you some of the most basic information that players are looking for, but we do have a lot of information that I'm going to cover. You guys asked for a deep dive, well, at least 180, something like that if you asked for a deep dive. And yeah, you're going to get it. There's going to be a lot of content, so I'm splitting this up into probably 3 parts at a minimum, as it's looking like this is probably going to be well over half an hour of total video length to cover everything that I planned and recorded for this guide. So yeah, the next part will take off right where we left off, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. And as always, have a great day.